Howdy. You're,
Hi, Kathy.
hi, Jeff. How are you?
How are you?
I'm good.
I'm good. Thanks for doing this. Did you get roped into it?
No, Gab roped into it. No, I got nicely asked by Gabby.
Oh, that's nice. I understand she has a wedding in her family.
Yes, her daughter. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
good.
that was, I don't know where the wedding is, but I was surprised to hear that. So that's nice.
Okay. Well, thank you again for doing that, and looking forward to hearing Kirsten today.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Do you have any idea how many people we have registered?
I do not.
Okay.
People don't register for them. We have the
Oh.
link.
Oh, okay. So
have
the
the
link
link.
is sent to everybody?
Yeah, the link was sent to everyone, and I spoke to at shul yesterday. Faggy's got, teaching religious school, and Sue Richards said she's got a funeral.
Oh, she had a funeral. Yeah, her cousin.
No relation to you, though, right?
No. I'm not related. No, but I know that it was a cousin of Sue's that passed away.
So, I mean, I know there are things going on today, so I'm hoping for a good turnout today, because we've promoted it quite a bit. It's a really very interesting topic.
Yes.
So we'll see. But it's also the summertime.
Yeah, but hopefully it's morning. So
Right. So let's see. I'm trying to decide where for me to take my laptop. Maybe I'll just move it over here, because I think Ann's going to join us, and
nice.
I just want to give her a little bit of space we can spread out. So
yeah, you've got space in that house. I know.
Yeah,
you
do a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you know the Silvers? Brian
and Beth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just heard that they're moving to Vegas.
Oh my goodness. No, I hadn't heard that. I just saw her the other day.
Yeah, no, I just saw that last night. Someone told me. So yeah, I guess, when you got your kids out of town.
Yeah.
Some people do.
Well, they've got grandkids in Israel, I know, right?
Yeah, and I think they have a son in Vegas.
Yeah.
And maybe they have.
That's the draw.
Yeah, hey.
You
gotta be near family. That's
it's hard. It's really hard having
Have you ever thought about that?
We've thought about it, but when we seriously thought about it, Steve's dad was still alive and he was in New York.
Sure.
We didn't want to be any further away.
Yeah.
And
this is the best place to live, though, in the country.
It is.
Nothing happens here.
Cross your fingers. Yeah, it's the other thing is you can't. I mean, it's a. What do I want to say? We wouldn't be able to sell this house and buy anything in California.
Sure.
Yeah. So we just decided to stay.
Good.
And visit good places.
Yeah, that's it's kind of nice to be able to do that. If you, like you say, if you move to California, it'd be very costly. You wouldn't have much jingle to
do anything else.
Travel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this way we can. We have Robin's boys are on vacation next week, so we get to go up there and watch them while the boys don't have school. So that'll be fun. It's close by.
Yeah. That should be great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I missed you yesterday in shul.
Oh.
It was it was nice. We had like 40 some. So that was just moving up. That's good.
Next, I was there last week. And I don't know, there were maybe about 30 this week. But then next week is my cousin Judy and Joel Schimbat's daughter's Ufruf.
Is that like that Father's Day weekend?
Next weekend? No.
No, it'll be 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it'd be
wait,
like the 13th.
next week is the 13th. Yeah, so the 12th, the day before the annual meeting.
So their daughters.
No, that's wrong. The UFRF is the 19th. It's the weekend.
Oh, it is that weekend. See, it is
Yeah,
Father's.
yeah,
mean,
it is.
Our anniversary is that weekend.
Oh.
There's so many things, and people, last year was our 50th anniversary, and on that particular weekend, like June 21st, other people have bar and bat mitzvahs, and it's like a long weekend. It's like we didn't get to celebrate. Of course, it was in the middle of COVID too.
Yeah, you couldn't celebrate anyway, right? Yeah, it's the weekend. The 19th is their UFRF.
Mm-hmm.
So there'll be a lot of people there, but I won't be there because I'll be in Wisconsin. Hi, Sharon.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Hey, Sharon.
Hello.
Hi, Sharon. I didn't get to talk to you yesterday, but I did get to give you a wave at shul.
You're muted.
Sharon, we can't hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
Cool. Hi, Sharon.
Hi,
Hi
Sharon.
there. I'm so excited for this.
I know, me too.
Ew.
Really. I'm going to be back in a minute, so don't think I've left.
Okay.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so Kirsten's book is very interesting, and I hope.
I haven't read it.
Okay, well, I think you know quite a bit about the topic, though, the
Yes.
topic in that. So you've certainly uncovered all the name changes of all your ancestors.
Yeah, most of them. Although, they keep popping up different, whoever wrote it down,
Yeah. Was Lieber your original name? I mean, your family's original name? I mean, when you went back, did you find a differences?
It's hard to say because my grandfather, it says Liver, Liver,
Okay.
on his ship manifest. But then when I did some Holocaust research, there were 50 Libers, Liber, in Poland who died in the Holocaust. So.
Did you go back before that?
No, I wasn't able to find anything before that.
Okay.
So, but at Yad Vashem, the listing at Yad Vashem had 50 Libers.
Oh, okay. It's a good name. You got muted, Kathy.
The phone was ringing. I wanted Steve to get it.
Okay.
So I don't really know. I just know that it said Liver, but I don't think that was really their name. The B and the V get interchanged.
Yeah, I think if I had the last name Liver, I would change it.
So I don't know. We sometimes think maybe it was Lieberkowski or, but we don't really know. We don't have any documentation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it does take a lot of effort to do that, but it's fun. I spent quite a bit of time and with your help to do that, and I'll go back and do it again, especially probably this winter.
Yeah, right.
Hi, Kirsten.
Oh, there's Kirsten.
Hi, Kirsten.
Hi.
I'm Jeff. And this is Kathy, and she is kind of like hosting it.
Hello, how are you?
Great. Hi, so nice to meet you. Sorry for being a little bit late. Hi, how are you?
Welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really excited. This is finally going to work out. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes.
We've been planning this for quite a long time.
I know. I'm trying to remember when you first contacted me, Jeff. It was because I was supposed to speak like in March or April, I think, initially, right?
No, it was originally scheduled in March.
That's what I mean, right?
Yeah,
So you must have contacted me in like January or something like that.
That's right.
Sorry, let me just turn off my text. Yeah, so I'm so thrilled to do this. I'm really looking forward to it. How many people do you expect will be here?
6. No, I don't know.
Okay, well then we're good. Let's get started.
It's 10:20. At 10:30, there will be probably a number of them that people will log on. So
okay, great.
we logged on a little bit early to have an opportunity to meet you, introduce ourselves, and also to see if we could have any technical issues that we need to solve.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I think it's a good idea to number one. Hold on one second. I'm gonna make you louder. If for some reason, whenever I start on a Zoom, other people are quiet. So I'm gonna make that louder. And then why don't you share? Let me share can I share my screen? Am I a co-host?
Yes, that's what I want to, I wanted to check.
This is Kathy Sperling. That's the co-host up there.
Okay, great. It looks like I have a button for sharing the screen. Should I just try it?
Yes, please.
Okay, great.
I didn't set it up, so I wasn't sure. Okay, good.
Yep, it looks all good.
Great.
Can you guys all see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great, excellent. And then the only other thing, I'm going to stop the share. There we go. And then the only other thing I need to do, I apologize, is I thought I had a printed out copy, but I actually don't. So I'm gonna, if you guys don't mind while we're talking, I hope this doesn't wake up my daughter because she is now sleeping in the room with the printer, but I'm just gonna print out the talk. I sort of do a blend between sort of speaking, ad hoc and then also having my papers. I hope that's okay. Sometimes people say that they can hear the rustling. I mean, the other option is that, I could give you the PowerPoint and I could read from my screen.
No, I want you to be comfortable.
Okay. All right, great. So I'm just gonna call up the, oh wait, hold on one second. The thing is still there. Let me just call up the document and print it out real quickly. I hope my husband will probably be upset if I wake up my daughter, but I actually think it'll be fine.
How old is she?
10:30. She's 11.
Okay.
So she's sort of verging on that teenage, but she's always been a super late sleeper. But usually, Jeff, when we talked about this initially, it was going to be Hebrew school time. This would have been, Hebrew school moment, but now it's June and there's no more Hebrew school. So
we have a few of the people that wanted to attend this morning, but they're teaching religious school, Sunday religious school.
Is that right? So you guys still have
not necessarily in Toledo, but via Zoom for other synagogues.
Oh,
So,
that's interesting. So we finished last week. We finished our.
where are you?
I'm in East Lansing. So it's a Lansing area synagogue. There's like 2 of them. So we just had our, end of school. We actually had a picnic. We actually were able to meet, masked, but the kids played in the park and it was actually a beautiful
day yesterday.
Yeah, hot. For us, it was very hot. Was it not hot for you guys?
Yeah.
Oh,
But not humid. It was lovely.
Not humid, right? So if you're in the shade, it's actually quite lovely. Same with us, right? Like very lovely in the shade, but very, very uncomfortable. Yeah. So, I'm supposed to go to the beach with my daughter this upcoming week, but it looks like it's rain. This perfect hot sunny weather is going to be gone.
Yeah, you're going to have rain all week.
That's what I've heard.
Do you have is Lansing on a river, or do you have like a source of water that you can picnic near and walk along?
We do, but I'm going to be at the beach in South Haven. Actually, I'm going to be.
I love South Haven.
Yeah, it's lovely. We really love it there. Do you guys vacation there? Is that someplace that you all go?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure.
Yeah, we go to Saugatuck a lot.
That you guys are close enough, right? Toledo is really not that far from us. Yeah, so that's interesting. I didn't grow up in this area, so I don't know what the I've always been interested to the radius is. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, we go there a lot. We love it.
We have Lake Erie.
That's lovely. Is that actually? Do people go there? No.
Yeah.
Like it's not as nice as Lake Michigan.
Is that right?
Lake Michigan is pretty special.
We feel like it is. I mean, it's interesting when you're in Michigan, most people from Michigan don't go there. It's a very, what I've been told is it's a very Chicago place, right? So, and read Jewish. The most people who are actually from here originally, like all the kids, in all the kids in my kids' schools, they all go up north, where they all have cabins left over from a family member, right? It's about 2 hours north, I guess, the finger. I'm not sure what the lake is, but it's not all the way up north, but it's like not, excuse me, Mackinac, but nobody goes to Lake Michigan. Like it's only transplants like us that go to Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
Excuse me for 1 second. I'm just going to plug in my computer.
Jeff, good morning. Are you going to do the intro and the closing and the Q&A, right?
Yes. I should ask you, it'd be reciprocal, Ivor, for you to do that.
No, you do it. I'm going to be a guest
Okay.
this morning. I'm going to be a guest. Yeah, I'm going to be a guest. God, I just want to say Boker Tov, good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see you all. I'm sure there'll be a few more people. We still have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Jeff, if you would just ask Kirsten to speak very loud and very slow. We have a number of seniors and
Duh.
they may have, excluding you and Anne, of course. They may have difficulty hearing unless Ms. Fermaglich speaks slowly and loud.
Okay. Ivor,
And that goes for everyone.
Ivor, your audio feed is a little echoey. I mean,
I have no idea why. That's because I'm in the sanctuary and there's a big dome above my head. Just kidding. Just kidding. Kathy, I'm glad you thought that was funny. Yeah.
Oh, you know what? I'm just with you. Whatever you want to say.
That's right. You're in agreement, right, Kathy?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Kirsten, I just want to make a request on behalf of congregants that, as in past Zoom sessions, we've had a whole slew of wonderful Zoom sessions all year, that you speak loud and slow, especially for the, the more senior people whose volume on their computers may not be turned all the way up, or there may be an echo like mine that's going echo, echo, echo. Okay.
Ivor, I should introduce. First, I want to introduce you to Hazan Lichterman, who's our religious leader at a congregation B'nai Israel. Of course,
Hello.
Wonderful to have you, Kirsten, and welcome. Where are you speaking to us from? Other than your living room or your study?
This is my study. I'm in East Lansing, Michigan.
Oh, so you're not that far from us.
No, not at all. We were just talking about that. We vacation in the same places.
Yeah. Very, very good.
Yes,
Wonderful.
I will try as best as I can. I do tend to be a New Yorker and I do tend to speak quickly. So I have had, I know that this is a concern. I'll try my best. You can definitely, while I'm talking, it actually is a little bit tricky. Oh dear, sorry. I'm just trying to organize the papers quickly to be able to speak, but I will do my best. I'll do my best. Actually, would you all mind?
Very good. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you.
Problem. Would you all mind?
Boker Tov, good morning to everyone.
Would you all mind if I just took 2 seconds? Maybe I'll just make myself black. I'll stop my video just to put my papers in order. So I'm ready to give the talk.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Okay. I'm going to mute.
Good morning.
It's good to see everyone. Probably half of us or more have changed our names or had our names changed when our ancestors came over. Some of us are muted, Nancy and Howard. Of course, we're all going to be muted once Kirsten begins her talk, which will start here in just a moment.
You needed a minute to work. It's okay.
She needed another minute. Okay, maybe now you should unmute.
I'm back. So sorry. Thank you for being patient. It's just some of the papers got out of order. I just wanted to make sure I didn't get to the middle and be saying something wrong. All right.
Well, I think we can begin now. I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in this morning. We've got a very interesting speaker and topic that we have been looking forward to her presentation for quite some time before many of you came on. I think Kirsten and I had been speaking about speaking at B'nai Israel maybe in March, and then it got delayed into April, then May, and of course now here comes June. So we have we've been looking forward to Kirsten speaking to us for quite a while already. So the date is finally here, and so without further ado, I wanted to introduce Kirsten Fermaglich. Help me, Kirsten. You're Fermaglich? Fermaglich. Thank you.
Kirsten Fermaglich.
Yes. And Kirsten originally came to our attention with after the publication of her wonderful book, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. I'm sure many of us have read it, and it's very well researched, and the title is a kind of a play on a quote from Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, like a rose by any other name, referring to Juliet's commentary with the Montagues and that. So, but before I go on any further, but Kirsten, you are an associate professor at Michigan State. You're not.
Actually, I'm a full professor.
I'm
a full professor, actually. They just fixed the website a couple of months ago, so you might have old information. But,
I checked the website from way back. You were assistant and associate, and now you're a full professor. Well, congratulations.
Yeah. The book helped with that.
So, as I mentioned, Kirsten is not only the author of Rosenberg by Any Other Name, but you had done we're an editor for the Betty Friedan's book, Feminine Mystique. Maybe was it the 50th anniversary of that of publication of that book?
Yes, that's right.
It was very well received.
It was a critical edition with lots of extra things added to it and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, well, very good. Well, I don't want to take much of your time because I think we have a lot to cover, and would appreciate if you would like to lead in with the story of how your book came to be written, and just because I read it and it was very well researched. I mean, you had to spend years developing this book, and it's a very interesting topic. So please share that with us, and also the body of the premise about Jews changing their names.
Sure. I thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much to Jeff for inviting me to speak. It's really, it's a pleasure. I pass Toledo all the time, but I haven't actually gotten a chance to be there, to stop there and still know, but it's really nice to be able to reach out to people so close. And thank you so much for coming on a Sunday morning as well. I know sometimes people would rather sleep in or play golf or go to the beach, but you know, I really appreciate your spending time with me, and thank you to Kathy for doing the technology as well. I will share my screen. Actually, a number of the questions you asked, Jeff, while I'm sharing my screen, I can say, you know, my flip answer to how I got started doing this research was that I have the name Kirsten Fermaglich. And so, of course, this would be something that I would be interested in doing, would be some work on name changing. Can everybody see that? Is that okay? Can everyone see the talk? Great. Okay. So yeah, so, you know, so I started doing this both for that reason, but also for the intellectual reasons. So it's as I give the talk, I'll sort of talk a little bit about some of the intellectual interests and also what it was kind of like for me to do the research. So I start off by saying, you know, the title of the book is A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, but you can see that the subtitle is The Rise, the Politics, and the Fall of Name Changing in the 20th Century. That's going to be how I'm going to kind of structure the talk, and I'll explain more about that later. So I'm just going to move on to this first panel, actually, before I even start. So usually when I give a talk in person, which of course I haven't done in a long time, but I usually start this talk by asking how many people in this room, in the Zoom room, have a name change story, kind of the way you just started, Jeff. And I'm curious, like, how many people would sort of raise their hands and say yes. So I'm seeing at least some people shaking their heads. Usually when I do this in a room, I get maybe half the room, has a name change story. And then if I also say things like how many people have a friend or a family member who changed their name, or maybe how many people have read a book or seen a movie that has a name change as part of the story. And usually by the end, everybody has their hand up. Usually this is something that, has really, if you think about it, it's really filled our popular culture, right? Our personal family stories, as well as our pop culture. There's anecdotes and jokes and folklore about name changing everywhere, especially in American Jewish culture, but also in American culture more broadly. So I like to start with 3 kind of anecdotes, jokes, stories that I think have really shaped our understanding of name changing, or they're at least they're popular enough that they take a part of our brains as we think about name changing. So I'll start with the first one, which is from Edward G. Robinson's memoir, All My Yesterdays. So Robinson was an immigrant from Bucharest, Romania, and he changed his name to Edward G. Robinson from Emanuel Goldenberg as an 18-year-old drama student. When he explains in his memoir, he says, "It was suggested to me, ever so tactfully, that Emanuel Goldenberg was not a name for an actor. Too long, too foreign, and I suspect too Jewish. Although the thought of changing it was unpleasant," he says, "somehow a denial of my beginning, somehow unfaithful to my mother and father and 5 brothers. He searched for a new American sounding name and adopted his middle initial G as, quote, my private treaty with the past." And if you don't know that story, you probably know other movie star stories, right? That sort of sound kind of similar to that one. Let me go on with the second story. So the second story is actually a very popular joke, which maybe most people could tell with me, right? An immigrant entered America at Ellis Island. He was processed according to the usual procedures, and these were very confusing to him. He was confused. He was overwhelmed by the noise and the bustle, didn't know what was going on. And so when one of the officials asked him, "What is your name?" he replied, "I schon vergessen," right? In Yiddish, "I've already forgotten." And the official then recorded his name as Sean Ferguson, right? Or Shane Ferguson, depending on how you know the joke, right? When I tell this in person, many people finish that story for me, right? They finish the joke. Not everybody's heard that joke, but a lot of people have heard that joke. And if you haven't heard that joke, you might have heard other jokes. There's a ton of them. And actually, I love giving talks because a lot of times people have other jokes for me, which are really fun. So that's another way that I think name changing kind of, plays a role, populates our brains in some ways. And then the third story is actually a scene from the popular film Hester Street, which was a dramatization of the Abraham Kahn novel Jekyll. I don't know if anybody's seen this movie. If you haven't, it's a wonderful movie. Go check it out. So Jekyll is an immigrant who has been in the US for several years and has tried to shed his old world life completely. He calls himself Jake. He prides himself on his Yankee clothes and his knowledge of American culture and the English language. When his father dies, he sends over for his wife and his young son. His wife here is named Giddel and plays his wife. But he is embarrassed of them. They are greenhorns. They don't fit into American culture. And ultimately, he leaves his wife and his child for a beautiful, more assimilated Jewish woman. And his wife, Giddel, as you can see in this picture, is confused and rejected. And the name change plays this kind of central role in her confusion in understanding her husband's new life. And it reflects the gap between the two of them. So I don't know if you know these 3 specific stories, but I would imagine that at least 1 or 2 of them probably sound familiar to you. And although the stories are substantially different, I'd like to point out that they share a crucial similarity. They all emphasize name changing as a profoundly individual activity. right? In the case of Edward G. Robinson, and indeed all movie star name changes, the name change is the act of an extraordinary individual, right? Someone who is distinguished by talent or charisma or beauty. And that individual talent kind of moves them into a new world, right? That separates them from their family and from their culture and community. Immigrant Sean Ferguson's name change, on the other hand, is the result of his profound isolation. His name was changed because he was a lonely individual, right, with no understanding of or connections to his new culture, and because he had no one to help him in navigating the system. And then finally, in Hester Street, name changing is identified with a shallow young man who wants to abandon his family and to remake himself entirely in the new world. All three of these visions of name changing suggest that name changing was an act that was entered into by individuals who or escaped from or betraying Jewish families, Jewish community. And I think that this is kind of what I went into the archives imagining and expecting. I think this is the image that has shaped our thinking about what name changing is. And so in contrast with these three popular stories of name changing, I'd like to offer you another, actually probably more common story of name changing in America. In 1932, a man named Max Greenberger petitioned the city court of the city of New York to allow himself, as well as two of his 4 children, to change their last name to Green. One of Greenberger's grounds for this change was that the name Greenberger is a foreign sounding name and is not conducive to securing good employment as a musician, the chosen profession of his daughter. Another ground was that the name Greenberger is not helpful towards securing an appointment as an intern in a hospital, the chosen profession of one of his sons. Greenberger's petition was one of thousands submitted in the middle of the 20th century to the New York City City Court. Men, women, and children like the Greenbergers legally changed their ethnic sounding names to less ethnically identifiable ones between really 1917 and 1960, really. And until the 1980s, Jewish names were represented disproportionately in these thousands of petitions. So I really identify this as kind of a phenomenon of particularly Jewish name changing at the middle of the 20th century. Yet before my book, historians had not seriously studied the significance of name changing in American or in American Jewish life. Scholars of American life have tended to take name changing for granted and to refer to its existence very casually. My book is the first historical book on name changing in the United States. I can show it to you here. This is it. I really want to sort of argue that I think by exploring name changing, the actual practice of name changing in more depth, as my book does, we can understand so much more about the lives of American Jews. The fact that Max Greenberger was not a young single man seeking to escape his Jewish past and succeed in an elite non-Jewish world, nor was he a hapless immigrant who was caught up by circumstances and had his name changed for him. Instead, he was a middle-aged father seeking to improve his family's economic status. I think that for us really illustrates the degree to which name changing was a voluntary activity that was entered into by Jewish men, women, and children for many good reasons. In the middle of the 20th century in New York City, name changing was a strategy of class mobility that Jewish families embraced themselves in large numbers together, working together. Name changing allowed Jewish families to attain and to strengthen their position in the American middle class. But that position came with communal disapproval, communal debate and disagreement, and also psychological cost. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. In my research for the book, and I'll go through to the next slide. In my research for the book, I examined the name change petitions that were filed with the City Court of New York City from 1887 through 2012. So I looked through over a century of name changes. So yes, it took a lot of time, and I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm happy to talk during Q&A if you'd like more about my methods, how I found this archive, how I went about sort of selecting the petitions that I would look at, because it was thousands and thousands. It is important to note too that I looked at other sources. I looked at Jewish organizations like the National Jewish Welfare Board and like the American Jewish Congress. But the bulk of my findings were indeed in New York City. And I like to say this, especially to audiences not in New York City, in Toledo or Michigan, because, a lot of times people want to know sort of how New York compares to other places. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. I want to explain a little bit about why I chose New York and what I think it means. So part of the reason I chose New York was because the records actually, the city actually allowed me to look at the records, whereas a lot of other cities did not let me look at them. These are still sort of active city files, and they're not usually available to researchers. So I was able to get special permission for access in New York City. The other reason that I chose New York City is that when I did this, my child was very young. So this is my son, who was 2 years old when I started my research. I'm from the New York area, and I didn't want to leave him alone for as long as it would take to look at thousands and thousands of petitions. And so since my mother and my mother-in-law were both in New York City or in the area, I knew that I could stay with them and leave him there, and I'd have babysitting and still be able to do my work, so I wouldn't have to be away from him for so long. So I'll also note that the research, as I've said, took a while. The book was published in 2018. A daughter showed up along the way. And she came with me for later research down the road. So it was quite a process. I think that looking at New York also, as the center of, or as one of the major centers of Jewish life in the world, and, sort of the largest Jewish population, there are interesting things that it can tell us, but there are also really kind of practical and kind of lovely reasons why I was able to sort of be there and still be able to be with my children. Before I start to explore the research, I do want to sort of say two things. So the first is that it's important to note that I am looking at formal legal name changing. And that's a voluntary activity that differs greatly from many people's understandings of name changing, like the story of Sean Ferguson. So a lot of people hear this as a joke, but a lot of people also sort of have their own family stories, right, of names that were changed by officials at Ellis Island. So I do need to sort of say, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A, most historians and genealogists believe that that kind of wholesale involuntary name changing probably didn't take place. There is not really any evidence for it happening. Ellis Island officials did not write down immigrants' names. So if you look at this picture, I really like to look at this picture more closely. You can see that the officials had these large books that are spread in front of them. Those are the ship manifests. Those were recorded in Europe when immigrants got on the ships. And so Ellis Island officials didn't actually say, what is your name? They actually called people's name up. I can show this is actually, if anybody's done any genealogical research through, Jewish Gen or, archives, you can, or through Ancestry rather, you've probably seen these kind of ship manifests. And you can see little check marks all the way through. That is the officials kind of checking off when they called your name, when they asked you questions, they are checking off the information that was already recorded in Europe. Immigrants didn't leave Ellis Island with any paperwork that bound them to any new name. Ellis Island officials had no power. They actually were specifically directed not to change anybody's name. So it's possible that there maybe were a few rogue inspectors who, sort of said, that's a bad name in America, choose another name. And, immigrants might have, said, oh, that means I have to change my name. But immigrants, for the most part, were living in neighborhoods and communities where everybody around them was changing their names quite informally and without any kind of paperwork, which it's legal to do in the United States. So there's really not very much evidence that there was name changing at Ellis Island. in this kind of involuntary officials coming in and handing you a new name. And instead, there's much more evidence of voluntary name changing, as in the name change petitions that I'm going to look at and talk about today. And I'm happy to talk more about this during Q&A, because I know that that's hard for people if they have that kind of name change story in their family. So I'm happy to talk about that more. So the other thing that I want to just kind of make clear is just because I'm a teacher, I like to kind of give you the outline of the book and of the talk so you know where we're going. So as I noted, the book is not subtitled this. This is what I wanted the subtitle to be, and the publisher wouldn't let me do it. But this is kind of how I imagine my book, and it's kind of how I imagine the structure of my project and how I'm going to talk to you about it today. So we're first going to talk about the rise of name changing in the years between 1917 and 1945. And then we're going to talk about the politics of name changing in the years after World War II, from 1945 to 1967, roughly. Some of those dates kind of get mixed around, both outside, but mostly inside the Jewish community, the kind of internal politics within the Jewish community. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about the fall of name changing in the 1970s and the 1980s, and kind of gesture towards beyond, although I may not get all the way to 2012. So that's it. You don't have to take notes, but that kind of gives you a sense for where we're going to be going. So first, let me talk a little bit about the rise of name changing. Between 1917 and 1945, the years between World War I and World War II, name changing in New York City grew exponentially. New Yorkers began to file name change petitions in numbers that were double, triple, and even quadruple those before the wars. Again, this is official name changing, right? It is stuff that's taking place on legal documents. And then it makes sense that that is then happening during these years between 1974 and 1917 and 1945, because it's official name changing. It's taking place, in these kinds of petitions. People are changing their names informally during these years all the time, right? They don't necessarily use legal petitions. Immigrant memoirs will talk about people changing their names. But with the wars, right, and with the Depression, as there is a growing government bureaucracy that is beginning to track individuals who need to pay taxes, who need to serve in the draft, who need to receive welfare benefits, work in defense plants. All of these things mean that the government is beginning to track and look at names, and names are taking on much more significance to the government, and therefore to ordinary individuals who are engaging with the government in ways that they have not before, that is sort of getting more deeply into their individual lives. Ordinary individuals are increasingly finding it necessary or desirable to make their name changes official in order to receive benefits and avoid penalties, right? So it makes sense that these things would track, right? That during these years, we would see a growth of name changing because the government now cares what your name looks like. It's actually sort of paying attention to your name and your name change. Jews, given that, so despite that everyone is kind of concerned about this, it's important to note that Jews were overwhelmingly and disproportionately represented in the petitions. So everyone is engaging with the government more, but it's Jews who are much more taking advantage of name change petitions. And I can give you some numbers, and it is true, people who are, and we can talk more about this in Q&A, people who are Italian, people who are Polish, people who have Greek names, they are all submitting petitions, but they are not approximating the numbers of Jewish petitions. So for example, in 1942, the total number of petitions that were submitted by people with Slavic, German, Italian, and Greek surnames, so all of those ethnic surnames, the number of people seeking to get rid of those kinds of surnames equaled altogether 1/2 of the Jews who are looking to change their names, right? So Jews are doing this well beyond, they're doing it at rates that are double, triple, sometimes even, quadruple their percentage in the city, and far and away more than other ethnic groups. Also important is kind of what I've described already. Large numbers of these petitions were filed by Jews together in families, right? Parents filing for underage children, as we've already seen in the case of the Greenbergers, but also, excuse me, spouses filing with one another, adult siblings filing with one another, sometimes with their entire families, and then sometimes entire families with adult parents, minor siblings, all filing petitions together, right? So this is actually sort of a major family phenomenon. Women regularly engaged in name changing along with their husbands, brothers, and fathers, and sometimes on their own as well. And even when a man was a sole petitioner to change his name, his wife had to file an affidavit approving, giving consent to the name change. And children were consistently the key subject in name change petitions. It wasn't actually unusual for parents to change the name of a child while keeping their own name. Sometimes people emphasized that they wanted to change their names because they wanted to maintain a store and a family name intact. Others, like Max Greenberger, expressed hopes that their children might have a better chance of finding a job or getting into school. So name changing was really a family strategy, right? All members of the family were a part of one economic unit, and they filed their name change petitions together in the hopes of helping that economic unit to thrive. So the final thing, and this is kind of where I'm going to go forward for the rest of this section, is to talk about why, right? Why are Jews doing this? And why are Jewish families feeling like this is important to them economically, right? We've seen a little bit that this is about the growth of bureaucracy, but I'm going to argue for you, and the growth of bureaucracy is pretty important, but I'm going to argue for you that there are two other things that are helping to explain why Jews in particular are so disproportionate. So some of that reason is upward mobility. So I have a picture that I like to show for upward mobility. So, sorry. So Jews are both in the middle class in larger numbers than other white ethnic immigrant groups. And this is, we're talking about Ashkenazic Jews, right, who are perceived as white, not necessarily Sephardic Jews. But white Ashkenazic Jews tend to be successful. They tend to sort of have risen into the middle class by this time. So in part, they have the money to spend on a name change petition. At this moment, it's expensive to change your name. You need a lawyer, you need to pay for the fees of the name change petition, and you also need to put an advertisement in the newspaper advertising your name change. So all of this costs money, and that helps to explain Jews are already fairly successful. They already kind of have the disposable income to help them do this. Also, and more subtly, it's worth noting, so this picture here that I have of Jews not Jews, but of people working sort of clerk, sort of middle-class jobs, but they're very sort of pink collar or sort of clerical positions. They're not necessarily always getting jobs as doctors and lawyers. But as they are getting jobs, middle-class jobs at this time are the jobs that are most inviting scrutiny. If you are getting a working class job, like for example, if you are trying to be a longshoreman, or you are trying to work as a domestic servant, or if you want a union job, you're probably going to get the job from a family member, right? Who's going to get you into the union, who's going to recommend you to their employer, or you might actually have your body be inspected on a street corner, right? A lot of times that would be, you would line up on a street corner and people would come by and they would select you as someone who could work for you, right? That was frequently what working class jobs were based on, an inspection of your body rather than your name. At this moment, middle class jobs, people who are looking for middle class jobs, are being asked to fill out applications. People who are trying to get into college, to use that to aid them in finding middle class jobs, are also being asked to put their names and enter information onto applications. So the jobs that Jews are searching for are far more likely to be scrutinizing their names on job applications. And so that makes Jews, again, as people more likely to be in the middle class, more likely to be noticing that their names are being watched, are being looked at. And so they are more likely to want a name change, or to know that if they've already informally changed their names, they need to formally change it so that there are no questions. So that helps to explain in part why more Jews is this very middle class, the fact that they've arrived in the middle class and that they hope to do better in the middle class. They want that upward mobility. At the same time, however, as you can see on this final point that I have on my PowerPoint, anti-Semitism also helps to explain this, right? Because Jews' names are being particularly scrutinized when they are on an application. Jews' names are particularly being seen as problematic at this moment when there is a growth of public institutionalized anti-Semitism in the United States. So I can give you some descriptions or some images to kind of show you what this anti-Semitism looks like for the Jews of New York City as they think about finding jobs or getting into schools. So here is a help wanted ad from the 1930s in the newspaper, the New York World. And if you look closely, you can see that you need to be Protestant for some of these jobs, or you need to be Christian for some of these jobs. They also use the term high type American as well, which is a code word for not being Jewish, not being an immigrant of any kind. But you can see this is perfectly legal in 1931. It's, perfectly fine to say that you want Jews or Protestants. And that is in fact what employers are doing. They are doing it in their help wanted ads like this. They are also doing it on their, when they write to employment agencies, right? So much of job finding in those days was by sending in a job to an employment agency and allowing the employment agency to do the interviewing and the processing of the applications. According to one 1937 report, 89% of large New York companies declared that they preferred Christians as employees when they submitted their job requests to employment agencies. And employment advertisements, as you can see, not only use this kind of, insisting that candidates be Christian, they also identified themselves as Christian or Anglo-Saxon firms, right? To sort of make clear that you could not even send in your application for this job. And then too, in the 1920s and 1930s, really beginning at schools like Columbia University and Harvard University in 1917, universities began creating the college application form that we know today, that asked questions that scrutinized not only people's names, but also scrutinized their entire backgrounds with the goal of keeping Jews out. So I used JFK's application to Harvard University, which you can't see quite so well, I don't think. But I use it in part because the universities actually either didn't keep or don't like to share this kind of information. So these applications, which were on their face discriminatory, are things that you can't really access from the archives. But JFK's application is made available publicly, so that's why I use it. But if you look at this closely, you can see that it features names like when and where was your father born? What's your father's occupation? What's your mother's maiden name in full, right? These questions were specifically designed, and there's literature that talks about the ways that these universities did studies of their Jewish students. Columbia and Harvard in particular did studies of who their Jewish students were, and then tried to fill out a profile of who they were, and then constructed questions that they thought would determine who the Jews were to get rid of them. And you can notice that these questions clearly, where is your father born? What's his occupation? All of these were used to try to sort of create a profile of a Jew. You can see also that there's an assumption that Jews were changing their names. And so in addition to, sort of asking for names, they also asked for a mother's maiden name in full, sometimes, a maternal grandparent, right? To be able to try to see whether they could find a Jewish name sort of lying and hiding, right? And then finally, sorry. Oh, does somebody have a question? Oh no, maybe just somebody's mute is off. Okay. And this is the kind of environment that Jews are looking at as they are looking to get into schools, as they are looking to get jobs. And then finally, by the 1940s, we can see really a rise of anti-Semitism in rumors and in, sort of all kinds of kind of scurrilous jingles and kind of anti-Semitic messages that are getting tossed around, not just in the public sector, but actually in the military as well. So Jews entering the military might join and find that their fellow soldiers are writing notes home that include this kind of a poem. So the first American, this is just the most famous of them. First American killed in Pearl Harbor, John J. Hennessy. First pilot, and apologies for the racism that's embedded in this as well. The first pilot to sink a Jap ship, Colin P. Kelly. First American to sink a Jap ship with a torpedo, John P. Buckley. Greatest American air hero, Butch O'Hare. First American killed at Guadalcanal, John J. O'Brien. First American to get 4 new tires, Abraham Lipschitz. And when I give this talk in person, sometimes people will laugh, right? Because it's funny, right? But the humor is a completely anti-Semitic one that is barbed and entirely intentional, right? This poem, and you can see it comes from a document. You could find this in military establishments. It sort of circulates everywhere in many different kind of versions, but all the versions include Irish and sort of English sounding names as the heroic names in the beginning. And the last name is always somebody profiting from the war and is always somebody with a Jewish name, a very distinctive Jewish name, like Abraham Lipschitz. So you can imagine that Jews in New York City are living in a world where all of this is their reality, right? This is the reality of getting a job. This is the reality of going to school. This is the reality of maybe just walking onto a subway, or maybe, entering into a military establishment, either as a defense worker or as a soldier. And so you can see this as the context. Petition after petition lodged at the New York City Civil Court hinted at these forces of anti-Semitism that were limiting petitioners' lives. So in 1937, Doris Sarietsky submitted a petition. She was a stenographer and a typist. She testified that my name proved to be a great handicap in securing a position. She went on to describe in great detail the jobs that she had not been able to get because of her name. In order to facilitate securing work, she says, I assumed the name Doris Watson. In 1932, Bertram Levy, who was the president of a mail chute corporation, explained that his name has been a hindrance to him in his efforts to gain an entrance to various firms and to secure business from them. Petitioners didn't mention anti-Semitism, as you can see. They don't say I have a Jewish name and I've been discriminated against. But it's pretty clear, right, that they are saying their names are hindrances in these kinds of economic spaces. Excuse me. So this gives you a sense, I think, of why it is so disproportionate for Jews to be changing their names. Their names are being desires, jobs, space in life and in the American military at a time when that was the expectation, that you would join the military. So that is, I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this, but I'm going to talk a little bit, that's the rise of naming. I think that context of upward mobility and anti-Semitism really helps to explain why we see thousands of name changes during that era, predominantly of Jews. Let me talk a little bit about the politics of this, particularly within the Jewish community, because, you might wonder, how do Jews feel about this, right? What is people's perception? I'll say that in the years that I've just spoken about, Jewish newspapers, magazines, they knew about name-changing novels and things like that. They knew about name-changing. They tended to associate it with sort of young people. They didn't tend to chastise people that frequently. It wasn't a major subject of conversation. The politics of name changing after World War II, after there have been these thousands of name changes, that's when it really kind of explodes, maybe to people's surprise a little bit. So one thing to know is that after the war, name changing continued at high rates. And this might go differently from what we might expect, right? We might expect after World War II, people saw what had happened in the Holocaust and were deeply ashamed and really rejected. Anti-Semitism became very unpopular. And so, Jews had a much more easy and comfortable life in the 1950s in America. And to be honest with you, that's frequently how American Jewish historians have described American Jewish life. One American Jewish historian described it as the golden age for Jews, the years between 1945 and 1955. I would argue that the petitions that I looked at show kind of a different story. Name changing continues at high rates, especially in the years right after the war, between 1946 and 1948. Very, very high years. 1946 is the highest year in the entire century. But even through 48 and even through the 1950s and even through the 1960s, the numbers go down for sure, but they are still far and away higher than they were before the war. And that lets you know that there are still continued fears of anti-Semitism and continued experiences sometimes of anti-Semitism for Jews during these years. And so even though it might be surprising, we might expect that the Jewish community might respond in the years during the war because they see thousands of people changing their names. Actually, after the war, there are still lots of people changing their names. And it's at that moment that the American Jewish community really begins to get much more anxious about name changing. There is much more intense communal debate and anxiety, right, about name changing. And interestingly, that anxiety, that debate actually is not just within Jewish magazines and Jewish newspapers and in Jewish neighborhoods, although it is in all those places. It's also even in just mainstream American life. Non-Jews are also being exposed to Jewish debates over whether name changing is a good thing or not. And I want to give you the contours of this debate, and then I'm going to describe a little bit more what it looks like. So many Jewish leaders publicly called name changers traitors, claiming that they were passing out of the Jewish community, that they were trying to pass as Gentiles and betray or leave the Jewish community behind completely. And this is rabbis, this is Jewish secular leaders, writers. There is a very popular image of self-hatred that was actually developed by a Jewish psychologist named Kurt Levin, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And the notion of self-hatred as kind of a means or sort of a beginning of passing out and trying to become non-Jewish really kind of animates the Jewish community in the 1940s and 1950s. There's this strong image that name changes are kind of the first step to leaving the Jewish community. Changers defended themselves. They were still, their new names made us in the new world. They said, traitors, we are not leaving the Jewish community. So let me give you some of these public portraits, both of Jews as self-haters and as traitors and passing, and then Jews' own perception of themselves as name changers. Sorry. There we go. So just one example of this image of rabbis sort of calling name changers traitors. Milton Steinberg was a rabbi who wrote a book, A Partisan Guide to the Jewish Problem in 1945, written for Hillel organizations on campuses, right? So organizations to help Jewish students. He was trying to help kind of, chaplains and rabbis on campus as Hillel to sort of handle Jewish life on campus. And he writes, first he says, sort of Jews, he says first, Jews who traveled near Gentiles wanted nothing more, this is a quote, wanted nothing more than to cease to be Jews and to be accepted as Gentiles. And he says, when this desire became great enough, Jews changed their names, dissociate themselves from their fellows, calculatingly conceal their origin, and try to pass. And it's noteworthy that college is seen as this kind of place where this kind of change is going to take place, right? This is a place where Jews are really in the presence of elite non-Jews, and that will be sort of the place where they will try to abandon their roots and pass as non-Jews. Perhaps the most famous portrait of a Jew whose name change reflected her own self-hatred was that painted by Laura Z. Hobson in the novel and then in the film, A Gentleman's Agreement. Have people seen that film? I love to use films. If you haven't seen that film, I strongly recommend it. It's quite wonderful. If you haven't seen it or read it, it's the story of a Gentile journalist named Phil Green who goes undercover as a Jew in order to expose anti-Semitism. And as he does, he is just battered by anti-Semitism from all ends. But what I think is really interesting is that possibly the most anti-Semitic character in both the book and the movie. Certainly the anti-Semite you get to know the best, right? And he's faced with all kinds of slurs and, sort of, passive aggressive comments and all kinds of things. But the person you get to know the best is his secretary, played in the film by June Havoc. And as Phil begins his research, she reveals to him that she is in fact Jewish and that she did in fact change her name in order to get her job at the magazine that they are working for right now, this liberal magazine that is seeking to expose anti-Semitism. So Phil goes to his boss and insists on getting this anti-Semitic policy changed. And when Elaine Wales is her name, when Elaine Wales, who has changed her name from Estelle Wolofsky, when Elaine Wales is made, is allowed to know about this change in policy, she's furious. And she says to Phil, how could you do this? You're ruining our position here, our privileged protected position here. If they just get one wrong in, it'll come out of us, she says to Phil. Don't you hate being the fall guy for the kikey ones, right? So she uses this really deep anti-Semitic slur, making it clear that she is distancing herself from all other Jews, right? And sort of happy to go along with this anti-Semitic policy, right? That will hurt her fellow Jews because of her own privileged desire to work at this magazine. So in the 1940s and 1950s, name changing really looms large, right? As an image of self-hatred, right? Sort of a symbol of self-hatred and a signpost on the way to passing, right? I'm going to pass myself off as a non-Jew. I want to be in circles of non-Jews. I want to kind of abandon or betray my fellow Jews. Is it really petitions in unpublished reports that actually who changed make very clear that they were abandoning the Jewish community, that this kind of is not all what they were intending. And I'll give you a few examples of this. So for example, in response to one author, so there was a big debate changing in the Atlantic magazine, this very kind of elite mainstream magazine in the 1940s and 50s. And there's a debate. There's somebody who says, I changed my name, and someone who says, I would never change my name. One woman named Beverly Winston writes a letter to the person who says, I would never change my name. And she explains that she had changed her name from Weinstein. Her name is Winston. Her family changed their name from Weinstein years before. And she writes in this letter to him, I don't consider my new name a camouflage or an evasion because I never pretend that I'm not Jewish, nor have I ever had the slightest desire to do so. She explained that she viewed her new name simply as a piece of acceptable clothing, like a quote, she says, like a corset, shoulder pads, or a sincere tie, right? Something just to help her get through social situations. In 1952, the Jewish Journal Commentary published a widely cited article, Name Changing and What It Gets You. Journalist J. Alvin Kugelmass went and actually interviewed 25 men and some of their wives in the New York metropolitan area who had changed their names. And it's clear that Kugelmass is influenced by this vision of self-hatred, right? And influenced by this notion that these men are trying to leave the Jewish community, because he says, kind of puzzled, like he doesn't understand it, right? In no case could I sense even the remotest inkling of a wish to abandon their Jewishness, right? So he clearly thinks that that's what is going on, right? Is that people are looking to abandon their Jewishness. But he says instead, they're all eager to talk to him, and they're all eager to insist that they are still Jewish. They are still involved in their synagogues. They're members of their synagogues. They're sometimes presidents of their synagogues, right? They explain that they did this for work purposes, but that they still are very connected to their Jewish identities and their Jewish communities. He does say, it was obvious that they were seeking not so much to escape Jewishness completely as to live a dual existence in which their private lives would be Jewish, but their exterior lives would be as smooth and even as they fancied the Gentiles, right? they are looking for, not to not stay Jewish, they are still looking for private lives that will remain very, very Jewish, but they are looking for something to make their new economic world, their new economically mobile world, as they are slowly getting jobs in the middle class, more easily accessible, basically, and face less questions and less possible sort of veiled discrimination and anti-Semitism. So this gives us a sense, I think, of sort of the politics of this, right? That there is this kind of intense anxiety, I would say, among both Jews who did not choose their names, Jews who chose not to choose their names and felt pressured actually by all these Jews around them changing their names. At the same time that people who had changed their names felt a great deal of personal attack. And there's a lot of personal stories about people facing attacks from local neighbors, teachers, other people when they changed their names. So that's kind of some of the politics that surround name changing. The book also talks about how this affects civil rights politics, actually, and civil rights activism for Jews. And I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A if you'd like. But I want to quickly just talk a little bit about the fall of name changing in the 20th century, really during the last 30 years of the 20th century. By the 1970s and the 1980s, the numbers of Jewish petitions finally did decline significantly in the New York City Civil Court. You can see this as a result of the upward mobility of the Jewish middle class. People have finally sort of reached a space where they don't feel like they need to do this. You can also see this as the successes of civil rights activism that made the kinds of discrimination we talked about earlier illegal. You can also see that Jews are migrating to the suburbs. So there are fewer Jews living in the suburb, in the city, and fewer Jews to actually be submitting the petitions we're talking about. So, I mean, and the numbers are quite striking. From 1942 to 1952, Jewish names between 62 and 80 by half, and between 82 and 92, there are no Jewish petitions, right? So there's a very substantial reduction of Jews. There's also a substantial reduction of name change petitions altogether because Jews were so important in the petitions. Ironically, at the same time, just as the practice of name changing is fundamentally disappearing from the lived experiences of New York Jews, name changing actually flourishes in popular culture as artists begin to sort of describe name changing as kind of the practice of Jewish men who betrayed their values for a corrupt American dream, right? So they're no longer just self-haters who are betraying the Jewish community. They're actually kind of buying into kind of a diseased and corrupt America, and kind of they are destroying their families, but they're also destroying kind of their communal life and kind of an American world. They're buying into kind of this ugly American dream. And I like to, I could go through in the book, I go through a whole host of artists like Allegra Goodman and Wendy Wasserstein. But here, I'll just talk about one film by Barry Levinson in the 1980s, Avalon. For people, I don't know who's seen that movie. Hopefully people have seen that movie. Go see movies, go see movies. So this semi-autobiographical film is maybe one of the best portraits of Jewish name changers during this era. And in this portrait, they kind of abandon the warmth of their immigrant roots, their family, for kind of an ugly American world, right? So the film describes the journey of the Krasinski family from their immigrant roots in Baltimore to the suburbs of the 1970s and 1980s. And one of the key moments in this journey is that the two cousins, one of them played by his name is escaping me, in this image, they are named Kay, they're named Krasinski, but they take the names Kay and Kirk. And their father is furious. He says, what are we, a candy bar? We're a family. Krasinski is the name of the family. And that name change is really telling, right? That name change is the beginnings of their move to the suburbs and their beginnings of their forgetting the loss of this patriarchal family and the loss of this patriarchal figure, the loss of their family, kind of ultimately kind of trapped in a television screen that's kind of flickering in kind of meaninglessness as they no longer care about themselves or each other anymore. And I think that this is just kind of one example of the ways that name changing by this period is more symbolic than real. In the 1940s and 1950s, name changers were attacked, but people knew name changers. They knew how it worked, and it was very real. It was understood they were looking for jobs and that they were escaping anti-Semitism. In these 1970s and 1980s movies, that anti-Semitism is kind of forgotten. The needs of Jewish families are kind of forgotten, and it instead becomes kind of this, sort of this embrace of an America that has no purpose or future. Whereas the reality of women, children, name changing their names for very real anti-Semitic purposes is kind of lost to another generation. So let me leave you with a few conclusions. Name changing is not a joke, although I like jokes and I'm happy to talk about them and share them. But I think one of the things that was really important for me about my book was really kind of insisting that we've treated name changing as a joke for a long time. And so we haven't looked at what it has meant seriously to people's individual lives, to families' lives, to the Jewish community's life. Jewish name changing reflected the upward mobility of the community, right? It helps us to understand Jews' success in the middle class through the 20th century. But it also helps us to remember the substantial anti-Semitism that Jews faced that sometimes really gets forgotten in some later images and later understandings. Sad to say now, this book has become more relevant as anti-Semitism has grown in American life. But nonetheless, these kinds of institutionalized and really rampant anti-Semitic restrictions against Jews are something that younger generations are not always familiar with or aware of. And it's really important, I think, to understand that as a motivator and as one of the chief features of Jewish life throughout the 20th century. Name changing shaped the American Jewish community. It created conflict and tension in that community, but it shaped how people saw themselves, how they saw their possibilities and their future, and how they saw their fellow Jews. And I would say that tension was so great that the reality of name changers' experiences was actually forgotten for decades, right? As kind of attacks on name changers became a much more common way of understanding name changing, or else jokes. So that is my talk. I'm happy. I thank you so much for your attention and your patience on a warm, sunny day. And I look forward to any questions or comments that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting, Kirsten. And I invite any of our listeners, if you have some questions, to either raise your hand and I'll see it and call on you. I'm sure number of us may have questions or comments that we'd like to make. So I'm trying to get a full view here. Hey, Kirsten.
I can stop the share.
All right, that's great.
Yeah.
So trying to get the full view here. So if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Carol.
Bill
Carol.
Richmond.
Yeah, Bill and
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that the Eastern European names that were changed from Kraczynski to Kirk were themselves name changed from Ben Yaakov or whatever, because in the 17th or 18th century, those names were not available.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And that shows up, in some of the literature that I've looked at. So yes, absolutely. Ashkenazic Jews took on last names, sort of surnames, much later than other groups in Europe. And they did so, but because they were forced to do so by the state, as the state was kind of, slowly and kind of sometimes unwillingly accepting Jews as citizens. Again, you can see the relationship between the government looking at people and the need for last names, right? The need for names to be consistent so that they can be watched, so that people can be taxed, so that they can be called upon for military service. All of that is actually operable when Jews took on these names. And I did absolutely find like letters where people would say, these are not, why should we care about changing these names? These actually aren't Jewish names. Why should I be loyal to a name that actually is only causing me grief and was a reflection of sort of the state's desires in an earlier century. Why should I feel bad about changing my name? So I think that's a really, really good point. And it absolutely sort of plays a role in the way that people are kind of perceiving name changes at this time. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I think it's a really great point.
Cantor, did you have a question?
Yes, this is more of a comment than a question, though I might end with a question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
First of all, Kirsten, thank you for a wonderful and detailed and scholarly presentation that we're thoroughly enjoying. I think it's interesting to note the parallel development of Jews' attempt to change their exterior appearance along with changing their names. The shedding of a kippah, the shedding of Orthodox appearances, the shedding of a beard, which obviously was more of an issue for men than it was for women. And the reverse that's taking place in the last maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and especially now with the proliferation of Orthodoxy in the United States, which has also an exterior element, the kippah, a hat very often, and so on and so forth. I want to ask you about the history of your name, Kirsten, if I can ask a personal question.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'll say to the first point. Yes, I actually had thought so definitely, I think that you make a really interesting point. Although I would also add, I think that those visible things happen even before this, right? I think as immigrants are coming, I think that they are identified as that. And so I think it happens a little bit earlier, but I absolutely agree with you that there are absolute ties to this. And actually been thinking about making this project also about nose jobs, actually. That was where I thought you were going to go, actually, and talking about visible appearance. Because actually nose jobs are actually taking place at a very similar time as well. And yeah, so I absolutely agree with you. I think it's a great point. Names, well, I thought that this would be a project that would incorporate all of these things together, but names wound up being so overwhelming that I thought I need to get the book done at some point. So I wasn't able to do that, but I think that's a great point. As for my name, I mean, it's interesting. People have pointed out to me that given the methodology of my own project, I wouldn't have counted myself as a Jew. You know, we can talk some more about how I actually did the counting and how I identified who was Jewish and who was not Jewish in the petitions that I looked at. But yes, my name is not one that is typically seen as a Jewish name. You know, my parents were children of the 70s, and they, you know, sort of thought the name was beautiful. I was named after the alcoholic in The Days of Wine and Roses, who was played by Lee Remick. They just thought it was a beautiful, and you know, I had this very unusual foreign sounding, you know, last name, and they thought having an unusual foreign sounding first name would be a good idea. So it was not a good idea for having to spell my name at every juncture of the world. But you know, that was their choice. And it's actually, to me, it's been very interesting to be doing work on name changing and to sort of be thinking about what it means to have a name that is more indeterminate, you know, that is not a name that necessarily identifies me as a Jew. My husband has a much more identifiable Jewish name. And so it has been very interesting to be doing this research with my kind of name and his kind of name, and then selecting names for our children, you know, and how we both process the kind of question of identification through names has been really interesting.
Great. I have the same situation. My first name is Ivor, I-V-O-R, which my parents named me in Cape Town, South Africa. It was considered very English. My parents were Holocaust survivors from Warsaw, Poland. They gave me this rare name, which parallels Yitzhak. So I live with that as well. So
that's very interesting. That's very, very interesting. Yeah. And yeah, no, I really appreciate that. It's actually funny. My first graduate advisor was named Ivor Bernstein. And I always thought of Ivor as a Jewish name because it was so unfamiliar to me and because he had it. And I knew his last name was Bernstein, and I knew he was Jewish, and it was a very identifiable Jewish name. And only recently have we talked as a result of my name, and has he told me that it was actually not a Jewish name and that he actually had this kind of experience. So I think that's really
wonderful.
Yeah.
Mother-in-law Harriet actually wants to ask a question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, it's not really a question, it's a comment. The change in people being very sensitive to what their name characterized in their background or their personality or where they came from. I think the biggest change in schools and public life was the change in the civil rights movement and the change of accepting Black names or names from China, different places in the movies. Those original names are accepted, even though they're hard to pronounce, hard to spell. In the beginning, people were very sensitive to that, with teachers asking, how do you spell your name? And this acceptance was spread through and made it very easy for Jews to be in public affairs and also to be in the movies with their original name or as musicians, all across the board. And we were helped, by the society.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, I think that's a great point. And I think you absolutely can see that kind of sort of ethnic pride, if you would want to call it that sort of move to ethnic pride being very important in kind of shaping a fall of Jewish name changing and sort of this kind of sort of much more welcoming of different kinds of names. I talk with people sometimes about thinking about the 1930s and 40s as being a moment of like incredible name conformity, onomastic conformity, right? Everyone felt like they had to have the same name. A lot of times I compare it if anybody's like a young parent or knows someone who's a young parent. These days, you choose a name and you want to make sure none of your other friends are choosing that name, right? Like the goal is to choose the unique name that nobody else has, right? And you get very upset if somebody else has your name. But it was not the case during this era, right? People were actually much more comforted and felt like they needed to have a name like Susan or Stephen, right? Names that fit in and blended in. And it was great if you had more than one Jennifer, that meant that it was a good name, right? And so I think you make a really wonderful point that this is a part of the change of moments. I will say that I still think that there are there's still a little bit of stigma towards Jewish names. People will frequently ask me if anybody goes back to their Jewish names in the wake of this moment of ethnic pride. And the answer is no. I found almost no Jews. I found a few Jews that I spoke to who went back, but just about no petitions. I found like 1 or 2 petitions of Italian Americans, but very few people actually go back to these names, which suggests that taking on a name that might still identify you as a Jew is not something people are always anxious to do. But I absolutely appreciate, and I think your point's really well taken. So thank you so much.
Sharon Heikowitz, do you have a question?
Hi, I have also not a question, but 2 comments. The first one is that my father was in the Army in the 40s, and his name was Abraham, his first name. His last name was Lang, which probably had been changed. And when he got out of the Army, he changed his name to Albert.
Really?
Because he was so ridiculed in the Army about being Jewish and having the name Abraham. So when the second comment is when we had our children, this sort of breaks my heart. We named my daughter Abby after him, and her name Abby means Abraham.
Yeah. Oh, that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry to hear that about your father.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaker.
It really is. And it's not, actually, I was very struck. And that was one of the first things that really struck me was how many veterans were people who changed their names. 1946 is the highest year for is the name with the highest number of name changes in the 20th century in New York. And 40% of them are veterans or their wives, right? And I think for many of them, it was about the anti-Semitism that they experienced in the military. So I'm sorry about that, but it is beautiful that you're able to give your daughter that name. And that's really lovely.
Thank you, Sharon. Nancy Raven, do you have a question? Nancy, you are muted. Nancy, can you unmute yourself?
I did it. It's amazing.
Okay, I actually have a question. Kirsten has a really unusual name in that her first name is what? the Scandinavian, but her last name sounds very German. And I was just wondering if she would share with us if the name has a translatable meaning.
So yeah, and I'm not actually like I'm not like a linguist, or like, you know, there are some people who are better experts than I, so I will only tell you what I've been told. I know that the name was Vermuglich. I know that the name was originally Vermuglich. So my mother has traced that. So it was a V, I believe O-E with an umlaut, R-M-A-G-L-I-C-H initially. So that's actually the name. So, and my understanding is that it's kind of Yiddish, that it means something about money, but I don't speak Yiddish. And so, but we've been told that it's like potential money or someone with possible money. Yeah. Kathy, do you have an idea?
Oh, I was going to say somebody who likes to play the lottery.
Oh, that's kind of true.
Oh, that's very interesting. It's always fun to hear translations.
Yeah, and we actually went through for a while because we did think it was German, but then we spoke to people who actually spoke German and they were like, that's not really German. Like we got sort of different kinds of answers. And then it was easier when my mother found this, this different spelling that was the original spelling. And as I say, like, I think that's the sense that I get, but don't quote me on it. I have a friend who does more work actually that's like linguistically, that would be a better person to talk to about it. But yeah, that's what we say.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks for the question.
Anyone else? Am I overlooking anyone? David Weinberg.
Vermaglich does in Yiddish does mean someone who has money. It means someone who. So there you go. I had just a question. There's an interesting parallel that occurs to me about Jews coming largely from Eastern Europe to Palestine and eventually to Israel, who changed their names with some of the same dynamic, in a very strange way, with some of the same dynamic. Certainly the dynamic of wanting to rid themselves of their Galut past or something, or at least their East European path, and to become more accepted and acceptable in the new country. It's an interesting and sort of ironic situation. My father, for example, lived in Palestine for a short time, and my name is Weinberg, and he came to Palestine and changed his name to Gafni, which is the same, vineyard, shall we say, Weinberg Vineyard.
Oh.
But it just occurred to me, it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of parallels.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this is something, so I've been hoping that there've been some newspaper articles. There hasn't really been any other like scholars who have sort of done like what I've done where they've gone through the records and really sort of tried to do some more sort of numeric or, some more sort of in-depth grappling with this. And I've always wanted there to be, because I really wanted to have a conversation with someone about this. But the Israeli historians who I've spoken to who work on this era have absolutely identified, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. I'm not an expert in it, and there's nobody else who is. So, I've done what I could, but yeah, absolutely. And I think, in addition to this kind of sense, I've talked to this one guy who was like, yeah, it's all about not being Eastern European, right? It's all about the shame of the Galut. It's all about the shame of being an Ostjuden, right? About being, sort of an Eastern European Jew that kind of matches both of these circumstances. The other thing that I talk about in the book that I think is significant is that, in Israel, the government is encouraging it very strongly, right, for people to change their names. And in the US, the government's not like pushing it in the way that Israel does, but it is kind of subtly encouraging it, right? It is kind of, it is permitting discrimination, and then it is providing name change petitions, almost, super easy to change your name, which is not true in Europe, right? In Europe, it actually is much harder to change your name. There were many more limitations on name changing. United States is very free. So I think there's another twinning there that's really interesting, not only about the desire of Jews to change their names from these kind of stigmatized Eastern European Jewish names, but also the government's encouraging it either very strongly or kind of subtly, but nonetheless. So I think that's a really great point. And I definitely agree with you. And I want there to be a scholar who actually does that so we can talk even more about some of the connections and comparisons. But I think it's a great point.
Just one last comment. There's a very similar development, though not as widespread, in France.
Yes. You mean today?
the gold to d'or, like for gold, and that's
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I know that there was recently, although I can't actually remember, you're right. And actually the person who's written about name changing in French, so there's not a lot of work on name changing, but there is some work on name changing in other states. The person who's written it in France is named Nicole Lapierre, which is stone, right? And so absolutely her name was a change name. I think there actually, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't remember, within the past few years, there's been a strong effort among people, I believe among people who had changed their names to French names. I don't want to get this wrong, but I think this is right. Among people who changed names to go back and retain their, take back their Jewish names, which the government was not allowing them to do initially. So yes, I think you're right. There's definitely parallels in other, and in England too, there's name changes as well. I mean, that definitely happens, but there's also more limitations, as we see from the French case, right? That the government is initially kind of putting the kibosh on this, which doesn't happen in the US. But thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good point.
I noticed, Kirsten, too, many African Americans are adopting perhaps African sounding names from their American names, and it is interesting. It's becoming more difficult to pronounce certain individuals' names, but they want to more closely identify with their African ancestors, perhaps. And but I also note too that you had commented earlier how having different last names within a family is also a source of perhaps divisiveness or lack of association with one's relatives, and that it's something I can relate to in my own family, and that, and so we're kind of a mishmash. Everyone is kind of like, you have all these choices to name yourselves and your children the way you wish, and but it doesn't. We're not moving toward a more cohesive society. It just contributes, I think, to a little more polarization, especially if you're like, having different last names in your family, or you're African American, usually having an American name, but then you adopt an African name. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it just is something we can, appreciate, that people do it for various reasons, not necessarily to minimize discrimination, but to really identify with, whatever their beliefs are or their ancestry.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. So there's definitely, I think that African-American names are frequently, sometimes they are about sort of, a lot of it is naming rather than changing names. In my petitions, I didn't see a lot of example of that, but I did see a lot of examples of people with sort of what you might call distinctive Black or distinctive African-American names, sort of naming systems, naming practices for Black Americans, I think, are frequently about choosing very unique names, choosing names that sort of borrow on some naming traditions from Africa and from periods of slavery and later. So there are names like, Lakeisha and, Laquan and things like that, that sort of borrow from other traditions. And what I actually found in my files that I talk about in the final chapter of my book, because there's very few Jews now in the files, but what there are a lot of Black and Latino and Asian American name changers. And they are not, you're right, for the most part, they have names from their traditions that they are not, for the most part, changing to adopt a more American name. Of course, there's no such thing, right? And that was true for Jews too, right? They were already American. Whatever your name is an American, it's an American name. But they were adopting sort of more American names for Jews. For Black and Latino and Asian people now, they are not embracing those. They're changing their names, but they're not changing their names to take on more American names. So they're keeping names that are still very distinctive and very different. And they're not interested. And I think they probably think they won't get any real economic or social benefit from changing their names to something, Judy or Sam or whatever. So I think that that's a really interesting point there. And it speaks to, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was who said it earlier, that, that there is, more ethnic pride, that there is more of a tendency to kind of embrace, your background. And I think that you can still see that in a lot of the petitions. Excuse me. And yes, if there's different names in the family, I mean, my family actually has different names, and we're pretty cohesive. But I do think that it is worth seeing that this has been a point of division, and that even still, my dad went back to a reunion, and there was some whispering and giggling about the person who had changed their name. I think that there's still some division and some tension. And in my book, I talked to some people, one family in particular, where it became a family secret. I've talked to a number of people like this, where the name change was kind of a secret, and it wound up being pretty painful for the family, for the kids. There's kind of more of a communal, there was this real kind of communal pain, and it kind of lasted sometimes in family stories. That's, it's there. It's not. It's important to kind of recognize, even as we hope we can kind of get past it.
Jeff, can I perhaps chime in with maybe a final or close to final comment, and perhaps you'll wrap it up. I just wanted to say, you talked about the nose change. I have great admiration and respect for Barbara Streisand. I think for Jews, she represents, it might just be her, but I think she represents a watershed, a change. Different spelling of her name, Barbara, her refusal to get a nose job despite pressure, or to change her name, Streisand, and her incredible international acceptance and kind of flaunting her Jewishness, like in the movie Yentl, her constant visits to Israel, and so on and so forth. Got to have great respect for her, standing her ground.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, and certainly sort of the attention to her nose, and sort of the way that became kind of this kind of public debate and discussion, and the ways that she kind of held to it, I think is a really good point. If I had gone on and done this as work on nose jobs, I most certainly would have addressed that, because I think you're absolutely right. That was really important and powerful, I think, in the community, for sure.
Right, and she's a product of what, the late 60s and the 70s, rather than now.
Absolutely.
She has quite a story. We have time for one more question. Terry Albert?
I'm relatively new in Toledo, moved in with my boyfriend recently, so that's why most of you don't know me, but look at all the Jewish names in this this Zoom event. It's amazing. I'm third generation American, so my supposed Louis Kamenkovich heard a first name, Albert, and then changed it to our last name, and that's our story. And my grandfather actually went to Harvard. He grew up in Kennebunkport, Maine, and then ended up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I was born. But he was at Harvard during that time period. So I'm curious how he ended up getting through, because he probably had to say some other names, but somehow he made it in there. And I got to say, I have such an innocuous Jewish name, but you look at me, I'm short, I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish looking and all that. But Terry, which is like, people say you're a Teresa. No, I'm not a Teresa, but Terry. But I was in advertising sales for a majority of my career. And I got to say, from the perspective of just being a career woman, it was nice not having a Jewish sounding name. I've never been ashamed of being Jewish, but I got to say, I think it really helped not, having just a very like Terry Albert. I mean, look at all the names here, the Bergs and the Steins and all that kind of stuff.
So true.
Thank you so much. I think that's really fascinating. And I'll say that the few people that I didn't do as many oral histories as I had hoped to for this, but the few people that I spoke to about their name changes or about their family's name changes, that they frequently would say, yeah, it probably helped, right? It probably helped. And in fact, Jews were they weren't choosing Christian names. They weren't choosing like sort of famous American names. They were just choosing names to help them get by for work, right? Just so people, didn't ask many questions, right? Just so people, just to make things easier. And the other point, it's interesting that you sort of were commenting on the names in the Zoom, because I think this is actually one of the interesting things for me. I've sometimes gotten some, pushback from people in audiences who will say, are you sure that these people who changed their names didn't really leave the community? Are you sure they really taught their children to be Jewish or things like that? And I'll say, number one, if you look at, synagogue records, look at your own synagogue, right? Look at the names around you, people, right? People who are deeply involved in.
Very good. You
Right?
kind of faded out there at the end there, Kirsten. I'm sorry. But
I'm sorry.
I say you faded out.
Did you not hear me?
Yes, now we can.
The point I was making, I'm sorry. So the only point I was making is just that, I don't know what you meant. You know, number one, like, I think it is helpful to, you know, it was helpful to people to change their names. Two, you know, these names have become Jewish names, right? The name Albert, you're now here, you're Jewish, you're at this talk, your name is a Jewish name, right? All of these changed names have become Jewish names. And so we can all look around and see that people have stayed in the Jewish community. Not everybody. There was a distinct minority of people who probably did leave the Jewish community. And I should make that clear. In other talks, I do make that clear. I did see petitions from people who converted and things like that. So that did happen for a minority, but for the majority of the thousands of people who are doing this, they were keeping their name, or rather they were changing their names, but they were keeping their Jewish identities and, you know, changing what it means to have a Jewish name.
Sure.
Could you hear all that?
Yes. Kirsten, we want to thank you. In conclusion, we want to thank you very much for spending a beautiful Sunday morning with us and kind of enlightening us about the Jewish name changes. I think we all learned quite a bit and had an opportunity to share some of our own experiences. So thank you very much. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't read Kirsten's book, to obtain it either by probably going on Amazon, there is the cover, or our library can obtain it for you as well. So thank you very much. This was great. And I also want to thank Kathy Sperling for hosting this for us. And it was great. It was just wonderful morning. So
Wonderful.
wish everyone a
thank you guys so much.
good rest of the day.
Audience, I thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Welcome,
Yeah,
Terry.
it was lovely to talk to all of you. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.